Hillman sets a screen, rolls to the basket.
Welcome to Clark USA fans United States Fire. She wasn't smiling. Not the polite smile for cameras. Not the confident grin of a champion. Something felt different. And pay attention, folks, because while the game was unfolding on the hardwood, another game was quietly playing out behind the scenes. Conversations during warm-ups. Quick glances across the court. Friends talking in tunnels. Veterans protecting territory. New stars refusing to bow. For years, Aya Wilson wasn't just a player in the WNBA, she was the WNBA standard. MVP awards? Collected. Championship rings? Earned. Defensive dominance? Established. Leadership? Unquestioned. She built her reputation brick by brick. Post moves perfected. Mid-range jumper automatic. Defensive timing elite. She didn't just win. She controlled games, controlled narratives, controlled respect. When broadcasters talked about greatness, her name led the conversation. But history in sports has a rhythm. Every dynasty eventually hears footsteps. And those footsteps weren't quiet. They were logo threes. They were sold-out arenas. They were record-breaking television ratings. They were Caitlin Clark. Clark didn't enter the league asking for validation. She arrived with confidence, shaped by pressure. College crowds that felt like playoff atmospheres. Defenders who tried to silence her range and failed. Doubters who questioned whether her game would translate and watched as it did. From the moment she stepped onto a professional court, something shifted. It wasn't just about points. It wasn't just about assists. It was about gravity. The kind of gravity that pulls cameras closer. The kind that fills seats in arenas that used to have empty sections. The kind that makes opposing fans show up early just to watch warm-ups. And that's where the tension began. Because when you've ruled for years, when you've earned every inch of your dominance, you don't easily welcome a narrative that suggests the future might belong to someone else. Behind closed doors, executives talked expansion. Marketing teams talked visibility. Sponsors talked opportunity. And somewhere in those conversations was an unspoken truth. The league was growing, and the face of that growth was becoming harder to ignore. Was it arrogance that made the reaction sharper? Or was it competitive instinct, the refusal to surrender the spotlight you worked so hard to claim? Aya Wilson represents power refined over time. She represents consistency, excellence, and the kind of two-way dominance that wins championships. Caitlin Clark represents disruption. She represents boldness. She represents a generation raised on unlimited range and unlimited belief. When Clark pulls up from a logo, it's more than a shot. It's a statement. When Wilson dominates in the paint, it's more than strength. It's a reminder. And the league stands at the intersection of both. This isn't about tearing down one to elevate the other. It's about what happens when eras overlap instead of politely handing off the baton. Veterans guard their legacies. Rookies build their futures. And sometimes, those timelines collide in ways that spark headlines, debates, and viral clips. Fans argue on social media. Analysts dissect body language. Commentators replay every hard foul and every stare down in slow motion. But beneath the noise lies something deeper: respect. Because whether spoken or not, true competitors recognize greatness, even when it threatens their throne. The real story isn't jealousy. It isn't rivalry for the sake of drama. It's evolution. Aya Wilson built a foundation of excellence that raised the league's standard. Caitlin Clark is pushing the ceiling higher with every fearless attempt. One represents dominance proven. The other represents potential exploding in real time. And here's the twist. The WNBA doesn't shrink when new stars rise. It expands. More eyes, more revenue, more global attention. That growth doesn't erase legacies. It magnifies them. So when cameras zoom in and emotions seem tight, remember this: greatness recognizes greatness, even when it competes against it. Aya Wilson isn't fading. Caitlin Clark isn't slowing down. They're sharing a stage at a moment when women's basketball is louder than ever. And maybe that's the real power shift. Not from one player to another, but from limitation to possibility. The throne was built through years of dominance. The movement is building through fearless ambition. The future? It belongs to both the one who established the kingdom and the one bold enough to expand it. Fire.
Bride from a logo.
Every morning, when Aya Wilson looked in the mirror, she didn't just see a basketball player. She saw sacrifice. She saw early mornings in empty gyms. She saw bruises earned in the paint and trophies lifted under bright lights. She saw someone who clawed her way to the very top of the sport through raw talent, relentless work ethic, and an unshakable belief in herself. She had earned her throne. MVP awards weren't handed to her, they were fought for. Championships weren't lucky breaks, they were built through dominance. She became the undisputed centerpiece of women's professional basketball. The face on posters. The name analysts mentioned first. The player opponents game planned around. And when you reach that level, when you've battled through years of doubt and pressure to secure your position, you don't plan on sharing the spotlight. Especially not with a college player from Iowa who hadn't yet played a single professional minute. At least, that's how it seemed. Then Caitlin Clark happened. And suddenly, everything felt different. Clark didn't enter the national conversation the traditional way. She didn't quietly develop behind veterans. She didn't wait patiently for recognition. She didn't ease her way into the league hoping to fit in. She detonated into the spotlight. Like a meteor tearing through the atmosphere, Clark arrived with force and left shockwaves behind her. Before she even stepped onto a WNBA court, she was already rewriting record books at the collegiate level. Deep threes from distances most players wouldn't dare attempt. Cross-court passes threading through impossible angles. Performances that turned routine games into national events. Even before Sunday, Clark was on a historic run. A run that forced the entire sports world to pay attention. Suddenly, arenas weren't just filling up, they were selling out weeks in advance. Cities that once had empty seats were now packed to capacity just to watch her warm up. Television ratings weren't just improving, they were exploding, reaching numbers the league had chased for decades. Every highlight show led with her name. Every debate show opened with her shot selection. Every social media timeline was flooded with clips of logo threes that defied logic. Look at Clark. Yes, Clark hits the three. Too much space. Nearly 10 million viewers tuning in. And she launched those shots with supreme confidence. No hesitation, no doubt. Just a fearless competitive fire that reminded longtime fans of legends they once believed were once-in-a-generation talents. This wasn't hype manufactured in a marketing room. This was organic momentum. And momentum is powerful. For Wilson, the shift wasn't about insecurity. It was about awareness. She understood how sports narratives work. She knew how quickly the media moves to crown the next big thing. She knew that attention, once divided, rarely returns to its previous balance. For years, she had been the gravitational force of the league. Now there was another orbit forming. Clark wasn't trying to disrespect the veterans. She wasn't campaigning to dethrone anyone. She was simply playing her game, aggressively, unapologetically, brilliantly. But brilliance creates comparison. And comparison creates tension. When Clark pulled up from 30 feet and buried another three, it wasn't just 2 points on the scoreboard. It was a reminder that the future had arrived ahead of schedule. When Wilson responded with dominance in the paint, powerful finishes, defensive stops, leadership huddles, it was her way of saying the present still belonged to her. Two forces. Two styles. Two eras overlapping instead of neatly handing off the baton. Wilson represents sustained greatness, the kind built through consistency and championships. Clark represents disruptive brilliance, the kind that transforms casual viewers into diehard fans overnight. The mirror Wilson looked into each morning still reflected a champion. But now, the reflection carried a new question. How do you protect a legacy when the spotlight begins to widen? Because the truth is, the league isn't shrinking, it's expanding. Clark's rise doesn't erase Wilson's accomplishments. It amplifies the stage they both stand on. And maybe that's the real story. Not fear, not jealousy, not rivalry for headlines, but transition. The moment when one generation proves its dominance while another generation demands its opportunity, loudly, confidently, and without apology. Clark didn't ask for space. She took it. Wilson didn't surrender her status. She defended it. And as the arenas fill and the cameras multiply, one thing becomes undeniable. Women's basketball is bigger than it has ever been. And at the center of that surge stand two competitors, one who built the kingdom and one who is determined to expand its borders.
Fire.
Bounds to Carla Lee. Clock going down. Bounce pass. Burton.
The media couldn't get enough of her. Every sports network led with her highlights. Every debate show dissected her range. Every analyst had an opinion. Caitlin Clark wasn't just trending. She was dominating the national conversation. Casual fans who had never watched a single women's basketball game were suddenly setting their DVRs just to catch her next performance. Families planned evenings around tip-off times. Social media exploded every time she pulled up from 30 feet. Her name wasn't just circulating within basketball circles, it was reaching mainstream America. And that kind of attention changes everything. Because attention in sports is currency. For years, Aya Wilson had been the face of dominance, the rightful queen of the league, the player whose excellence demanded respect. She earned every ounce of admiration through championships, MVP seasons, and leadership that elevated her team. But now the spotlight wasn't fixed. It was shifting. And sharing the spotlight is easy in theory, much harder in reality. From the outside, Clark's rise looked like a gift to the entire sport. A rising tide lifts all boats. More viewers, more sponsorships, more packed arenas, more national relevance. The kind of growth players had fought for over decades. But when you've been the centerpiece for so long, watching someone else receive overwhelming adoration can feel personal, even when it isn't. Instead of seeing Clark as a colleague, instead of recognizing her as a fellow ambassador, instead of embracing the moment as historic growth, a line was drawn, not publicly, not dramatically, but internally. A decision was made. Clark wasn't just another player. She wasn't just a talented rookie. She became competition in the deepest sense, an enemy. And that's where the tension truly began. The campaign didn't start with bold declarations or obvious confrontations. It was subtle. So subtle that most observers dismissed it as coincidence. A liked post here, one questioning whether Clark's game would translate professionally. A quiet comment there, suggesting hype can sometimes outpace reality. A clipped response in a press conference that felt just slightly sharper than necessary. Nothing explosive. Nothing that could be definitively called out. But enough to plant seeds. In the age of screenshots and digital receipts, subtle gestures speak loudly. Fans analyze every interaction, every omission, every eyebrow raise. And soon, the narrative began to take shape. Was this rivalry? Was it resentment? Or was it simply elite competitors refusing to bow? Clark, meanwhile, kept shooting. She didn't respond with interviews. She didn't escalate with social media posts. She responded the way she always had, with confidence and performance. Deep threes. No-look passes. Fearless drives. Each game expanding her following. And the numbers kept climbing. Ratings surged. Jersey sales spiked. Crowds swelled. The kingdom wasn't shrinking. It was expanding. But expansion can feel like invasion when you've guarded the gates for years. Wilson's legacy was built on sustained excellence, on proving doubters wrong season after season. She wasn't handed the crown. She fought for it. And fighters don't easily step aside. Yet Clark wasn't asking anyone to move. She was simply stepping into space that hadn't existed before, space created by her own talent and amplified by a hungry audience. Two truths existed at once. Wilson deserved every ounce of respect she had earned. Clark deserved every ounce of excitement she generated. But in competitive environments, nuance often disappears. Fans chose sides. Comment sections turned into battlefields. Analysts framed every matchup as symbolic, old guard versus new wave, established dominance versus disruptive brilliance. And with each subtle jab, Each perceived slight, the rivalry narrative grew stronger. What began as admiration turned into comparison. What began as comparison turned into tension. And tension fuels storylines. But here's the deeper reality. Great eras aren't defined by one star alone. They're defined by collisions, by moments when greatness meets greatness and neither blinks. Wilson wasn't fading. Clark wasn't slowing. They were simply occupying the same spotlight at the same time. And maybe the real question wasn't whether one could handle the other's rise. Maybe the real question was whether the league and its fans were ready to embrace a future where two powerful forces coexist. Because kingdoms in sports don't crumble when new stars emerge. They evolve. And evolution is never quiet.
Fire.
Great look at this one.
Mabry has...
It didn't happen in one dramatic explosion. It unfolded in fragments. A cryptic tweet here. A carefully timed post there. Nothing direct. Nothing that could be quoted as open hostility. But enough to raise eyebrows. Whenever Caitlin Clark delivered another jaw-dropping performance, another logo 3, another record shattered, another sold-out arena, something curious would follow. On the timeline of Aya Wilson, throwback highlights would surface. Clips of MVP celebrations, championship parades, defensive player of the year moments, posts emphasizing what it really takes to succeed at the highest level. The timing was hard to ignore. Clark breaks a record? Wilson posts a reminder of veteran dominance. Clark trends nationally? Wilson highlights years of sustained excellence. Individually, each post seemed harmless. Collectively, they painted a pattern. Fans began connecting dots. Was it coincidence or calculation? In the digital age, perception moves faster than facts. Screenshots circulate. Threads go viral. Analysts dissect tone and timing. And soon, what might have been subtle gestures turned into a full-blown narrative. Then came a moment that amplified everything. When it was announced that Time had named Caitlin Clark its 2024 Athlete of the Year, the sports world reacted with celebration. Caitlin Clark is Time Magazine's 2024 Athlete of the Year. It was more than an individual honor. It was symbolic. Recognition that women's basketball had broken through to mainstream cultural relevance in a way rarely seen before. An acknowledgement that the game had grown beyond niche coverage into primetime conversation. For many, it felt like a win for the entire sport. A milestone. A moment that veterans, rookies, and fans alike could rally around. But instead of unity, the online atmosphere felt tense. Wilson's digital presence did not echo celebration. There were no congratulatory posts amplifying the achievement. No visible embrace of what it meant for women's basketball as a whole. Instead, her feed leaned into messages about longevity, about proving oneself over years rather than moments. The tone wasn't explosive. It was restrained, measured, but unmistakably skeptical. To supporters of Clark, it looked like resentment barely concealed beneath professionalism. To defenders of Wilson, it looked like pride, the natural reaction of someone who had fought for recognition long before the spotlight intensified. And that's where the story deepens. Because awards like Athlete of the Year aren't just about statistics. They're about narrative impact, cultural shift, visibility. Clark's influence extended beyond box scores. She brought new demographics into the arena. She sparked debates across networks that rarely discussed the WNBA in prime slots. She became a crossover figure. And that kind of meteoric ascent can feel destabilizing to those who built the platform she's now standing on. Wilson's career was forged in consistency. Years of elite play. Championships earned through grueling playoff runs. Leadership that shaped locker rooms. She didn't explode into fame. She constructed it brick by brick. Clark's rise, by contrast, felt like a lightning strike. And lightning attracts attention. The contrast wasn't just stylistic, it was generational. Wilson represents sustained excellence over time. Clark represents immediate cultural impact. When those two forces collide, tension isn't unusual. It's almost inevitable. But here's the irony. Clark's popularity didn't diminish Wilson's legacy. It expanded the stage. Every new viewer tuning in for Clark inevitably witnessed Wilson's dominance too. Every sold-out arena elevated every player on the floor. The sport was growing. Yet growth can feel like displacement when narratives shift. What made this saga compelling wasn't open confrontation. It was nuance, the careful language, the strategic silence, the timing of posts that said just enough without saying anything directly at all. In another era, these tensions might have remained private, confined to locker rooms and sideline conversations. But in today's hyper-connected world, everything leaves a trace. And the story became bigger than two players. It became about recognition, about who gets credit for building something and who gets credit for transforming it, about whether established greatness and emerging superstardom can coexist without friction. Clark kept playing fearlessly. Wilson kept asserting her status. Two competitors. Two narratives. One rapidly expanding spotlight. And as the digital whispers grew louder, one truth stood clear. This wasn't just a rivalry on the court. It was a battle over perception, legacy, and who defines the next chapter of women's basketball.
Three-time Olympian, and she's been a great...
For anyone truly paying attention, the message felt unmistakable. This wasn't just competitive fire. It wasn't just veteran pride.
It felt deeper than that.
To many observers, Aya Wilson no longer viewed Caitlin Clark as a rising star who could elevate the league alongside her. Instead, Clark appeared to be seen as something far more disruptive, an existential threat to the narrative Wilson had spent years building through sacrifice, championships, and relentless consistency. And here's the reality about jealousy, whether in sports, business, or life. It rarely stays hidden. You can dress it up in professionalism. You can filter it through carefully chosen words. You can mask it behind media training. But eventually, it leaks. It leaks in interviews. Moments where Wilson would emphasize phrases like real impact or sustained excellence. On the surface, those are valid concepts, cornerstones of any great career. But the context, the timing, the subtle emphasis often felt intentional. As Clark's meteoric rise continued, those phrases seemed less like general commentary and more like carefully aimed distinctions. As if to say, there's hype, and then there's legitimacy. There's moments, and then there's longevity. The contrast didn't need to be spoken outright. It was implied. And implication can be louder than accusation. As Clark's popularity soared, beyond ratings benchmarks the league had chased for decades, the tone of the conversation subtly sharpened. What may have begun as restrained skepticism gradually felt more pointed, less subtle, more personal. Passive-aggressive remarks became harder to dismiss as coincidence. Reporters would ask about Clark's record-breaking nights, about sold-out arenas, about cultural impact, and instead of engaging directly, the responses often pivoted. The subject would change. The focus would shift back to team goals, to championships, to the bigger picture. Again, none of it was explosive. None of it crossed a clear professional line. But patterns tell stories. And the patterns suggested discomfort. Because here's what makes this dynamic so complex. Wilson earned her status the hard way. She fought for every ounce of recognition in a league that historically battled for mainstream attention. She was part of the generation that demanded respect when few cameras were pointed their way. Then Clark arrived, and suddenly the cameras multiplied. From Wilson's perspective, that shift could feel unfair. Years of dominance didn't generate this level of mainstream frenzy. Years of excellence didn't produce this kind of viral spotlight. From Clark's perspective, she was simply playing the game the way she always had, boldly, confidently, unapologetically. Two realities coexisting. But perception matters. When reporters repeatedly asked Wilson about Clark, it subtly reinforced the idea that the league's center of gravity was shifting. Even when Wilson delivered elite performances, the narrative looped back to the phenomenon surrounding Clark. That's a difficult adjustment for any established superstar. Yet here's the paradox. Clark's rise didn't erase Wilson's legacy. It amplified the league Wilson helped strengthen. More viewers meant more visibility for everyone. More ticket sales meant more growth opportunities. More media coverage meant more recognition for veterans who had long deserved it. But human emotion doesn't always follow logical economics. Competitive athletes are wired differently. They measure respect and attention and acknowledgement in who gets mentioned first. And when that order changes even slightly, it can feel seismic. As Clark's highlights continue to dominate headlines, the contrast between celebration and skepticism became sharper in the eyes of fans. Social media dissected every word, every pause, every tonal shift. Supporters of Clark saw insecurity. Supporters of Wilson saw rightful defensive legacy. And somewhere in between sat the truth, complex, layered, human. Because at its core, this wasn't just about one player rising. It was about identity. Wilson built her identity as the defining force of her era. Clark emerged as the defining force of a new one. When eras overlap, friction is almost inevitable. The real question isn't whether tension exists. The real question is whether greatness can expand without feeling replaced. Because women's basketball is experiencing something rare, exponential growth fueled by both established excellence and explosive new energy. Wilson represents the foundation. Clark represents the surge. And as interviews continue, as headlines multiply, and as the spotlight widens, one undeniable truth remains. The game is bigger now than it has ever been. And history will remember this moment, not just for rivalry, but for transformation.
It's out. Oh, it's deep. KT even put it in.
In the eyes of many fans, the turning point came when every Caitlin Clark milestone began to feel reframed as something personal. Another record? Another sellout crowd? Another major award? Instead of being celebrated as proof that women's basketball was reaching new heights, each moment seemed, at least publicly, to land as a comparison point. And that's where the perception shift became powerful. Because when you start interpreting someone else's rise as a direct threat to your own legacy, everything changes. Every headline feels loaded. Every statistic feels like subtraction. Every new endorsement deal feels like displacement. To critics, it looked like Aya Wilson was making a critical mistake, turning Clark's success into a referendum on her own greatness. Instead of seeing growth, she appeared to see replacement. Instead of seeing expansion, she appeared to see erosion. And that distinction matters. Legacy isn't reduced when the sport grows, it's amplified. The pioneers of any era benefit when the next wave brings more attention, more revenue, and more respect to the game. But emotionally, it doesn't always feel that way in the moment. It can feel like territory being challenged. Wilson may have believed she was defending something bigger. The respect for veterans, the grind behind sustained excellence, the idea that longevity deserves more credit than hype. From that lens, her stance could be interpreted as protective rather than petty. But perception is powerful. To many observers, it didn't look like protection of the league. It looked like protection of ego. And here's where the story deepens. What few fans consider during public rivalries is who else might be watching quietly in the background. Not bloggers, not debate shows, not social media commentators, but decision makers, executives, national program leadership. When it comes to international representation, particularly with an institution like USA Basketball, performance is only part of the equation. Talent matters, of course it does. But so do chemistry, optics, and the ability to represent the sport on a global stage. If tension becomes a storyline, it doesn't stay confined to fan debates. It gets evaluated.
Carefully.
Professionally. Team building at the highest level isn't just about stacking stars. It's about cohesion. It's about narrative control. It's about ensuring that when the jersey says USA, the focus remains unified. And while mainstream basketball media often frames rivalries in dramatic terms, the quieter conversations happening in boardrooms are far more clinical. Who elevates the brand? Who stabilizes it? Who handles pressure with composure? Who fuels division, even unintentionally? These are questions that rarely make headlines but always influence decisions. Here's the uncomfortable truth about elite sports. Sometimes the flaw isn't visible in the box score. Sometimes it's emotional positioning. If you interpret every rising star as an attack, you risk shrinking your own presence. If you respond to momentum with resistance instead of alignment, you risk appearing insecure, even if your accomplishments are undeniable. And Wilson's accomplishments are undeniable. Championships, MVPs, defensive dominance, leadership through winning seasons. None of that disappears because Clark draws ratings. But in the court of public opinion, narratives can snowball fast. Once fans believe tension exists, every interview becomes evidence. Every non-answer becomes a headline. Every subtle expression becomes a clip. Meanwhile, Clark's approach, whether intentional or instinctive, remained consistent. Play hard, speak confidently, keep moving forward. That contrast became part of the story. Established excellence reacting. Emerging superstardom accelerating. Now, this is the territory mainstream coverage rarely explores. How generational shifts test not just skill, but adaptability. The secret flaw in moments like these isn't competitiveness. Great athletes are supposed to be competitive. The flaw is personalization. When growth feels like loss. When collaboration feels like compromise. When evolution feels like threat. Sports history shows us something important. The legends who endure the longest are often the ones who embrace the next wave instead of resisting it. They redefine their leadership within the new landscape rather than fighting the landscape itself. The league is expanding. The spotlight is widening. The audience is multiplying. And in that expansion, there is room for both sustained greatness and explosive emergence. The real question isn't who deserves more credit. It's who adapts best when the game, and the attention around it, changes forever.
Help in Phoebus, show fire.
They talk about MVP trophies. They talk about control in the paint. They mention that Aya Wilson is a 2-time Olympic gold medalist and a multiple-time WNBA champion. They point to her ability to take over games, to bend defenses, to live at the free throw line. On paper, it's the resume of a modern great. But here's where the conversation gets more technical and far more nuanced. There's a term that sometimes circulates among fans and analysts, the idea of a star whistle. Not a conspiracy, not corruption, just a recognition that in many professional leagues, established superstars often benefit from familiarity and reputation. Officials know their tendencies. Defenders guard them more aggressively. Contact is scrutinized more closely. Wilson averages a high number of free throw attempts in WNBA play. On the surface, that signals dominance, a player so difficult to guard that opponents are forced into fouls. And to be fair, drawing fouls is a skill. Footwork, timing, angles, strength through contact. These are legitimate tools elite players use to pressure defenses. Wilson's physicality, balance, and inside presence absolutely contribute to those opportunities. But here's where stylistic differences matter. The WNBA game, like the NBA, often emphasizes freedom of movement and protection for offensive players. Hand checks are limited. Body contact is closely monitored. Offensive rhythm is prioritized. In that environment, players who attack consistently and absorb contact can thrive at the line. International basketball, however, operates under a different framework. Under FIBA rules, officiating standards can feel more physical. The paint can be more crowded. Defensive contact that might draw a whistle domestically may be considered incidental internationally. Referees from different continents bring different interpretations of verticality, continuation, and advantage. The game slows down in some ways and becomes more rugged in others. That contrast creates adjustment challenges for many players, not just Wilson. The question isn't whether Wilson is skilled. She clearly is. Her footwork, defensive instincts, rebounding presence, and post efficiency are proven at the highest levels. The deeper basketball conversation is about adaptability. If a significant portion of a player's scoring efficiency relies on consistently drawing fouls in one league's officiating environment, how smoothly does that translate when the whistle changes? Some players adjust seamlessly. They lean more into mid-range touch. They refine passing angles out of double teams. They anchor defense when scoring tightens. Others require time to recalibrate. This isn't about diminishing Wilson's accomplishments. Olympic gold medals don't happen by accident. Championships don't materialize from favoritism. Elite players succeed because they possess layered skill sets. But it is fair to analyze stylistic dependencies. In international play, the lane can feel more congested. Help defense rotates faster. Contact tolerance increases. Officials prioritize flow differently. Meanwhile, perimeter-oriented players who create space and shoot from distance sometimes find the transition smoother. Stretching defenses horizontally can neutralize physical congestion inside. That's where the contrast in styles becomes fascinating. Wilson's power game versus the long-range gravity of Caitlin Clark represents two different stress points for a defense. One punishes you vertically. The other punishes you horizontally. International basketball often rewards versatility above specialization. The ability to score without relying on whistle frequency becomes critical. Efficiency must survive when free throws decline. Again, this is an accusation. It's analysis. Every great player has contextual strengths. Every system enhances certain styles. The real strategic question for any national team staff isn't who dominates domestically. It's who adapts internationally. Because when the whistle changes, when the spacing shifts, when the defensive tolerance increases, reputations don't matter. Execution does. And that's the layer of the conversation that rarely makes highlight reels. Not rivalry. Not social media tension. But stylistic translation. The global stage has different physics. And in that arena, adaptability becomes the ultimate skill.
The bank shot. That makes it a 4 game. Minnesota up as we start the fourth.
Different rhythm. Different whistle. Under FIBA rules, referees are trained with a global standard in mind. They aren't influenced by domestic MVP races. They don't adjust calls based on social media following. They officiate according to international interpretation, and that interpretation often allows more physicality in the paint. Contact that might send a player to the line repeatedly in a typical WNBA setting can simply be ruled incidental in international play. Vertical contests are given more leeway. Post battles are rugged. Help defenders are allowed to bump and recover. And that changes the math. When evaluators from USA Basketball analyze exhibition games and international matchups, they aren't just looking at points per game. They're looking at translation. How does a player's scoring profile hold up when the whistle is less frequent? The lane is more crowded? Defensive contact is tolerated? Offensive flow isn't interrupted by constant free throws? For players whose offensive efficiency relies heavily on drawing fouls, those adjustments can be significant. That doesn't mean they lack skill. It means their efficiency ecosystem changes. In domestic play, Aya Wilson thrives with physical post positioning, strong takes through contact, and the ability to consistently get to the line. That's part of her dominance. Drawing fouls is a legitimate weapon. It pressures defenses. It controls tempo. It punishes aggressive coverage. But when that weapon becomes less available internationally, the question becomes, what remains? In FIBA-style competition, scoring often has to come clean. Jump hooks over length. Quick reads out of double teams. Mid-range precision. Defensive versatility. If free throw frequency drops sharply, efficiency must hold steady elsewhere. Now compare that with Caitlin Clark. When Clark scores, much of it comes from distance, and distance is universal. A 30-foot pull-up doesn't depend on whistle interpretation. A step-back three doesn't rely on continuation calls. A deep catch-and-shoot bomb isn't negotiable. What's that? About 26 feet? It doesn't matter if it's 26, 28, or 30. If it drops clean through the net, no referee on earth can erase it. Perimeter gravity translates globally because space translates globally. When Clark pulls up well beyond the arc, defenses stretch. Help defenders hesitate. Lanes open for cutters. The floor widens in a way that doesn't depend on officiating style. That's why shooting range is often considered one of the most portable skills in basketball. Again, this isn't about dismissing Wilson's international resume. She has competed and succeeded at high levels, including Olympic gold campaigns. Elite players adapt, and Wilson has proven she can contribute on the global stage. But stylistically, The contrast is fascinating. Wilson's dominance pressures defenses vertically, through strength and interior presence. Clark's dominance pressures defenses horizontally, through spacing and range. International tournaments compress time. Shorter preparation windows. Fewer games. Quick adjustments. Teams that adapt fastest often prevail. In that environment, players whose offensive creation is less whistle-dependent sometimes find smoother transitions. The broader lesson? Basketball isn't just about talent. It's about context. Rules shape rhythm. Whistles shape efficiency. Spacing shapes opportunity. And when the arena shifts from domestic dominance to global competition, the evaluation criteria shift with it. The Olympics and World Cup don't reward reputation. They reward adaptability. They reward skills that survive any officiating environment. And in that universal space, beyond trophies, beyond narratives, the game simplifies. Can you score clean? Can you create space? Can you impact without interruption? That's the layer most fans never see. Not rivalry, not headlines, but translation. Because on the global stage, only the most adaptable versions of greatness endure.
Drive, Alamon, quick pass, Jackson.
When people talk about international basketball, they often miss one crucial detail: different stage, different rhythm, different whistle. Under FIBA rules, referees are trained with a global standard in mind. They aren't influenced by domestic MVP races. They don't adjust calls based on social media following. They officiate according to international interpretation, and that interpretation often allows more physicality in the paint. Contact that might send a player to the line repeatedly in a typical WNBA setting can simply be ruled incidental in international play. Vertical contests are given more leeway. Post battles are rugged. Help defenders are allowed to bump and recover. And that changes the math. When evaluators from USA Basketball analyze exhibition games and international matchups, they aren't just looking at points per game. They're looking at translation. How does a player's scoring profile hold up when the whistle is less frequent? The lane is more crowded? Defensive contact is tolerated? Offensive flow isn't interrupted by constant free throws? For players whose offensive efficiency relies heavily on drawing fouls, those adjustments can be significant. That doesn't mean they lack skill. It means their efficiency ecosystem changes. In domestic play, Aya Wilson thrives with physical post positioning, strong takes through contact, and the ability to consistently get to the line. That's part of her dominance. Drawing fouls is a legitimate weapon. It pressures defenses. It controls tempo. It punishes aggressive coverage. But when that weapon becomes less available internationally, the question becomes, what remains? In FIBA-style competition, scoring often has to come clean. Jump hooks over length. Quick reads out of double teams. Mid-range precision. Defensive versatility. If free throw frequency drops sharply, efficiency must hold steady elsewhere. Now compare that with Caitlin Clark. When Clark scores, much of it comes from distance, and distance is universal. A 30-foot pull-up doesn't depend on whistle interpretation. A step-back three doesn't rely on continuation calls. A deep catch-and-shoot bomb isn't negotiable. What's that? About 26 feet? It doesn't matter if it's 26, 28, or 30. If it drops clean through the net, no referee on earth can erase it. Perimeter gravity translates globally because space translates globally. When Clark pulls up well beyond the arc, defenses stretch. Help defenders hesitate. Lanes open for cutters. The floor widens in a way that doesn't depend on officiating style. That's why shooting range is often considered one of the most portable skills in basketball. Again, this isn't about dismissing Wilson's international resume. She has competed and succeeded at high levels, including Olympic gold campaigns. Elite players adapt, and Wilson has proven she can contribute on the global stage. But stylistically, the contrast is fascinating. Wilson's dominance pressures defenses vertically, through strength and interior presence. Clark's dominance pressures defenses horizontally, through spacing and range. International tournaments compress time. Shorter preparation windows. Fewer games. Quick adjustments. Teams that adapt fastest often prevail. In that environment, Players whose offensive creation is less whistle-dependent sometimes find smoother transitions. The broader lesson? Basketball isn't just about talent. It's about context. Rules shape rhythm. Whistles shape efficiency. Spacing shapes opportunity. And when the arena shifts from domestic dominance to global competition, the evaluation criteria shift with it. The Olympics and World Cup don't reward reputation. They reward adaptability. They reward skills that survive any officiating environment. And in that universal space, beyond trophies, beyond narratives, the game simplifies. Can you score clean? Can you create space? Can you impact without interruption? That's the layer most fans never see. Not rivalry, not headlines, but translation. Because on the global stage, only the most adaptable versions of greatness endure.
Root trying to get the rebound. Holt comes up with it with 5 in the half. Beck.
When she's going left, in rhythm, rising up from well beyond the arc, defenders can be draped all over her, and it barely matters. Because when Caitlin Clark absorbs contact, she doesn't flail. She doesn't freeze mid-play waiting for a whistle. She adjusts in midair. She recalibrates her angle. She finishes anyway. Her step-back threes. Her pull-ups from 28 feet. Her deep catch-and-shoot bombs in transition. That's self-reliant offense. She wins with shot selection, anticipation, footwork, and processing speed. She manipulates defenders with pace. She reads help rotations before they fully commit. When contact comes, it's something to solve, not something to sell. That's why her game feels portable. Anywhere. Any whistle. Any arena. Now put that beside Aya Wilson at her most dominant. Wilson's brilliance has often been built on controlled physicality, sealing position early, initiating contact on the gather, forcing defenders into difficult angles. In the WNBA environment, where offensive stars are often protected and contact is scrutinized closely, that formula is devastatingly effective. But stylistically, there's a visible difference. Wilson often creates contact, then pauses, instinctively aware of the whistle's power to reset the possession and award free throws. Clark anticipates contact and plays through it. Wilson's method thrives in a tightly officiated domestic setting. Clark's method thrives in chaos because it depends almost entirely on pure shot-making and decision-making. And when you watch them side by side, the contrast becomes unmistakable. One style leverages structure. The other survives without it. Now, here's where the narrative shifts dramatically. When USA Basketball released its preliminary selection pool for the 2026 World Cup cycle, a tournament that also impacts long-term Olympic planning, the basketball world leaned in. International competition is different. Short rotations, compressed preparation time, FIBA officiating standards. And when the list circulated, one absence stood out. Wilson's name wasn't there. If reports and insider whispers are to be believed, the reaction was intense. The player who once felt untouchable within the system suddenly faced the reality that roster spots aren't guaranteed, not by awards, not by past medals, not by resume. International programs evaluate differently.
Chemistry.
Adaptability. Role acceptance. Fit within evolving schemes. While Wilson had long been associated with success at the highest levels, the shift suggested something larger was happening. Meanwhile, Clark's inclusion sparked a very different tone. Congratulatory messages. Excitement from teammates. Optimism from fans eager to see how her spacing and shooting would translate under FIBA rules. Clark's public response? Simple. Gratitude. Humility. A thank you message expressing excitement to learn and compete. No commentary on controversy. No subtle shots. No victory laps. Just acknowledgement. The contrast in optics was striking. While one camp reportedly worked behind the scenes, making calls, seeking clarity, attempting to control narrative, the other leaned into opportunity without noise. Stories surfaced suggesting scheduling conflicts, timing issues, logistical explanations. But fans are perceptive. They recognize spin when they see it. And here's the part that rarely makes highlight reels. National team programs track more than performance. For years, Evaluators observe behavior in camps, exhibitions, media settings. They assess how players respond to role changes, how they handle sharing the spotlight, how they integrate with different personalities. Every comment gets logged. Every interaction carries weight. Because representing your country isn't just about scoring, it's about stability. Coaches building toward a World Cup or Olympic cycle think in 4-year arcs. They aren't just selecting the best individual talents. They're constructing ecosystems that must function under pressure. If a player's style struggles to translate physically, that matters. If public narratives create friction, that matters. If adaptability appears limited, that matters. And when decisions are finally announced, they often reflect 2 years of quiet observation. Not one game. Not one interview. Not one award. 2 years. That's why moments like this feel sudden to the public, but methodical to insiders. Clark's rise wasn't just about viral threes. It was about global portability. Her range stretches FIBA defenses. Her off-ball gravity opens lanes. Her scoring doesn't depend on officiating patterns. Wilson's resume remains elite. Championships and gold medals don't vanish. But international cycles evolve. Systems change.
Personnel priority shift.
And sometimes, the hardest adjustment for any superstar isn't physical. It's psychological. When the throne you believed was permanent turns out to be rotational. When the spotlight you mastered becomes shared. When the future doesn't ask permission, it simply arrives. The real difference between great players often isn't talent. It's response. One reacted with urgency and narrative control. The other reacted with gratitude and opportunity. And in international basketball, where cohesion and composure matter as much as points per game, those responses can define entire cycles. Because at the global level, nothing is owned. Everything is earned again.
Especially in the second half. Rachel Panna.
When national team decision-makers evaluate players, they're not just studying box scores. They're studying patterns. Every cryptic social media post. Every subtle jab in an interview. Every moment where competitive fire crosses into public friction. None of it exists in isolation. Within organizations like USA Basketball, long-term evaluations are methodical. Staff members observe how players handle praise, how they handle criticism, how they respond when another star captures headlines. Because when you're building a roster to represent the United States on the world stage, talent is only the starting point. Chemistry matters. Emotional control matters. Character matters. International competition operates on a completely different wavelength than domestic league play. In the WNBA, rivalries can fuel ratings. Media debates can energize storylines. Social media tension can even amplify visibility. On the Olympic or World Cup stage, those dynamics are liabilities. Under FIBA tournaments, the margin for error shrinks. Games are compressed. Preparation time is limited. Opponents are unified by national pride. Crowds are hostile, loud, and often speaking languages players don't understand. And the pressure? It's suffocating. When you step onto that floor wearing USA across your chest, expectations aren't about personal milestones. They're about gold. Every possession carries weight. Every turnover echoes. Every emotional reaction is magnified by global cameras broadcasting to millions. The Olympic stage doesn't just test skill. It tests composure. It tests whether a player can remain steady when officiating feels inconsistent. The crowd is roaring against you. Momentum swings violently. Social media erupts in real time. In those moments, statistics don't calm a locker room. Leadership does. Humility does. Unity does. If evaluators sense that a player prioritizes personal narrative over collective harmony, that becomes a strategic concern. International tournaments are short. There's no time to repair fractured chemistry or soothe ego clashes. The team must function as one organism. That's why decision-makers quietly catalog behavior over time. Not because athletes aren't allowed to be competitive, but because competitiveness must be channeled constructively. When one player's public posture appears to diminish another teammate's achievements, it raises questions. Will she celebrate others' success? Will she accept a reduced scoring role if necessary? Will she adjust her game for the greater good? Those questions matter more internationally than they do domestically. Because in a league season, there's room for individual arcs. In a global tournament, there is only one arc, the team's. The Olympics spotlight magnifies everything. A subtle eye roll becomes a viral clip. A frustrated gesture becomes international commentary. A dismissive quote becomes headline news in multiple countries. Players aren't just athletes at that point. They are ambassadors. They represent culture, professionalism, resilience. That's why character often outweighs counting stats in final roster decisions. Raw talent can win games, but emotional intelligence sustains championships. When analysts debate inclusion and exclusion, they often focus on points per game, efficiency ratings, advanced metrics. But inside national team meetings, conversations frequently revolve around trust, stability, adaptability,
Team-first mentality.
because when the final seconds tick down in a gold medal game, nobody cares who had more Instagram followers. Nobody cares who won more domestic awards. They care about who stayed composed, who uplifted teammates, who put ego aside. The Olympic stage doesn't shrink personalities. It exposes them. And for programs chasing gold, exposure is either a strength or a risk. That's why, in the end, character isn't a soft factor. It's the foundation.
Just 5 of 22, Bana.
The global stage has a way of stripping everything down. It exposes weaknesses that domestic play can sometimes mask. It magnifies emotional reactions. It reveals who an athlete truly is when the pressure stops being theoretical and becomes national. When a player steps onto the court wearing USA across her chest under FIBA competition, it's no longer about individual arcs. It's about collective identity. Every expression, every reaction to a whistle, every exchange with a teammate is broadcast worldwide. That's why programs like USA Basketball evaluate more than talent. They evaluate temperament. Handling criticism on social media is one thing. Handling 15,000 hostile fans overseas, chanting, booing, waving flags, is something entirely different. Responding to a rival's success with grace domestically is one test. Responding with unity when the gold medal is on the line is another. International pressure compresses emotion. A tough whistle in a regular season game? Frustrating. A controversial call in a gold medal matchup? Potentially defining. That's where composure becomes priceless. Coaches who've been through Olympic cycles understand this intimately. They've seen rosters stacked with talent fall apart because personalities clashed. They've seen championship hopes derail not from a lack of skill, but from ego misalignment. One unstable emotional reaction can fracture trust. One visible resentment can divide a locker room. One player who internalizes everything as personal can unintentionally destabilize an entire system. And that's why reaction matters as much as resume. When selection decisions don't go an athlete's way, the response becomes part of the evaluation. Quiet resolve signals maturity. Public spirals raise questions. This isn't about demonizing anyone. Elite competitors are emotional by nature. They care deeply. They invest years of sacrifice into earning opportunity. But the difference between emotional investment and emotional volatility is crucial on the world stage. Imagine a high-stakes international final, a tight fourth quarter, a controversial possession. If frustration turns outward, toward teammates, officials, or media, the ripple effect is immediate. Cameras catch everything. Opponents sense vulnerability. Team cohesion tightens or fractures in real time. Contrast that with a player who absorbs the moment, recalibrates, and refocuses the group. That distinction often decides medals. Throughout her rise, Caitlin Clark has been defined publicly by bold play and visible competitiveness, but also by a pattern of quickly resetting. Missed shot? Next possession. Hard foul?
Keep playing.
Criticism? Keep shooting. Meanwhile, Aya Wilson has built a career on dominance and leadership in domestic settings. Her resume speaks loudly. Championships and international medals don't materialize without strength and resilience. But at the highest international tier, the evaluation lens narrows. Can you celebrate another star's moment without feeling diminished? Can you accept a different role without internal resistance? Can you lose a roster battle and respond with growth instead of grievance? Those answers matter deeply, because the Olympics magnify everything. A glare becomes a headline. A sideline outburst becomes global commentary. A locker room rumor becomes international speculation. The stakes amplify personality traits, good or bad. That's why national programs often prioritize players who demonstrate adaptability, humility, and emotional steadiness over those who rely purely on dominance. Talent wins games. Character sustains legacies. And on the global stage, where margins are razor-thin and scrutiny is relentless, emotional intelligence isn't optional. It's essential. The coaches didn't just evaluate talent. They imagined scenarios. They pictured the final minutes of a gold medal game under the bright lights of Olympic Games pressure. They imagined hostile crowds in a packed FIBA arena. They visualized controversial calls, momentum swings, and emotional flashpoints. And then they asked the most important question: who steadies the storm, and who becomes part of it? That's where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Over the past 2 years, Caitlin Clark has operated under a microscope unlike almost anyone in modern women's basketball. Every shot dissected, every turnover debated, every facial expression analyzed frame by frame. She hasn't just faced normal competition, she's faced narrative competition. Relentless commentary, manufactured rivalries, constant attempts to minimize her impact. And through it all, silence.
Focus. Production.
While others engaged in subtle social media gestures, Clark responded the old-fashioned way, by stepping onto the court and letting performance drown out noise. That discipline matters to USA basketball decision-makers. Because international tournaments aren't just about who can score 30 points on a Tuesday night. They're about who can handle weeks of global scrutiny without cracking. Sponsors notice that composure. Executives notice that steadiness. Teammates notice that humility. Contrast that with moments where interviews subtly shifted from team-focused messaging to individual positioning. When praise for younger players feels conditional. When acknowledgement sounds strained instead of celebratory. Chemistry cannot survive that dynamic for long. Look at the emerging synergy between Clark and Aaliyah Boston. Their connection didn't materialize out of nowhere. It was forged in high-level collegiate battles, strengthened by mutual respect, and refined through shared ambition. When Boston dominates a matchup, Clark celebrates. When Clark hits a deep three, Boston runs the floor with energy. There's visible joy, not tension. That kind of alignment is oxygen for a national team. It's also why complementary players like Sophie Cunningham fit so naturally into that dynamic. Confidence without ego. Intensity without insecurity. International basketball demands role acceptance. Some nights you're the primary option. Other nights you're spacing the floor, setting screens, defending relentlessly while someone else shines. The players who thrive are the ones who can detach personal statistics from personal worth. They check the box score at the door. They understand that legacy at the international level isn't built on individual highlight reels. It's built on collective sacrifice. If a player's recent history suggests a pattern of centering narratives around individual recognition, selectors have to weigh that heavily. Because once the tournament starts, there's no room for internal friction. Clark's track record shows something different. Publicly, she speaks about learning from veterans. She talks about contributing in any way possible. She frames success in terms of we, not me. That mindset travels well. It survives hostile environments. It strengthens locker rooms. It turns talent into cohesion. And cohesion wins championships. When coaches project forward, not backward, they're not just asking who has been dominant. They're asking who will amplify others, who will embrace adaptation, who will respond to adversity by tightening bonds instead of widening divides. On the global stage, ego is heavy. Humility is powerful. And when the margins between gold and silver are measured in a single defensive rotation or one extra pass, the emotional architecture of a team matters just as much as the skill set. That's the difference. And that's why character evaluations often speak louder than stat sheets.
Those puppies and
In elite competition, willingness to sacrifice is the ultimate separator. The greatest players aren't the ones who demand the spotlight. They're the ones who can step away from it when the moment calls for something bigger. True leaders do whatever it takes to help the team win, even if that means fewer shots, fewer headlines, fewer personal accolades. Because in the end, character isn't just important. It's everything. What we're witnessing right now in women's basketball isn't just a roster adjustment. It feels like a philosophical shift, a recalibration of values, a new standard for what earns opportunity at the highest level under USA basketball. The era of reputation carrying decisions is fading. The era of complete, undeniable, fundamentally sound skill, paired with emotional discipline, is rising. And that shift echoes far beyond one tournament cycle. When selectors prioritize professionalism over pettiness, unity over ego, long-term growth over short-term noise, they send a message to every rising star watching. Build the game. Elevate your peers. Expand the audience. Represent the jersey with maturity. That's why Caitlin Clark represents more than highlight reels. Her appeal crosses borders. During her college run, international fans tuned in not because they were told to, but because they were drawn to the range, the creativity, the fearless shot-making. Deep three-pointers don't require translation. Competitive fire doesn't need subtitles. Global audiences connected. And that matters on platforms like the FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup and the Olympic Games, where the sport isn't just played, it's showcased. There's a difference between maintaining an existing fan base and expanding the game worldwide. One approach protects territory. The other builds new ground. Looking ahead to 2026 and then toward 2028, the global sports calendar is packed with iconic stages and once-in-a-generation visibility. Those tournaments won't just measure box scores. They'll measure impact, leadership impact, cultural impact, global growth impact. A system built around intelligence, floor spacing, vision, and unselfish pace changes how a team breathes offensively. It invites movement. It encourages trust. It rewards players who cut hard, defend relentlessly, and celebrate each other's success. Distractions, however small, become magnified in those environments. Preparation cycles for international competition are short. Chemistry must accelerate. Focus must be airtight. Any constant undercurrent of tension drains energy that should be spent on execution. That's why emotional steadiness becomes strategic value. History shows that power rarely collapses loudly. It erodes quietly. What looks like unwavering confidence can slowly harden into entitlement. What begins as leadership can unintentionally drift into isolation if adaptability disappears. In elite circles, reputations don't fade because someone loses a game. They shift because of how someone responds when influence is shared or when the spotlight widens to include someone new. That's the deeper layer here. Was this simply one roster choice? Or is it the beginning of a broader recalibration in women's basketball? One where influence is earned continuously, not preserved automatically? One where legacy opens doors, but character keeps them open? If the balance of power is evolving, it won't be announced in a press release. It will unfold quietly, through playing time decisions, leadership dynamics, media narratives, and the way future teams are constructed. Because this story was never just about a single selection. It's about direction. It's about what kind of culture represents a nation on the world stage. And if this truly marks the beginning of a new era, then the question isn't whether change is happening. The question is who adapts fast enough to thrive within it.